All right, so now let's go over the SNMP versions. So we're going to start off going over version 1 and version 2. And the reason is because they essentially give us the same capabilities. Version 2 just gave us a little bit more functionality when it came to the community strings. But SNMP V1 and V2 are both similar in that they don't provide really any protection for SNMP messages. So let's just dive right in, right? So V1 and version 2, C, they're going to use what we call community strings to authenticate to a network management server. And these community strings, they're a unique way to describe what is essentially just a password. All a community string does to authenticate between NMS and SNMP agent is literally just a password, just text. So when we configure SNMP version 2 in our lab, you're literally going to see me put the community string as Cisco 123 on both the agent and the server. And boom, there you have it. There's our community string. So there's no username, password. There's no other true authentication other than just this essentially pre-shared key that we set up. And in SNMP lingo or vernacular, that's called a community string. And in the CLI, you'll see why too. It makes sense calling it a community string in the slides because that's what you'll see kind of in the CLI. And then SNMP version 1 and version 2 do not provide any encryption or integrity for their SNMP messages. So these community strings will get sent plain text. There is no way to do any hashing or encryption on them. And then they do provide you the ability to create read-only and read-write community strings. So you could define a couple community strings on your device where one lets you do read-only. Maybe that's for the junior network administrators to have access to. And then we have read-write strings that maybe as a senior network administrator, that's what the community string you'll be using to actually make configuration changes from your central point of management, which is your SNMP server or NMS. And then version 3, which is, I wouldn't say it's the most popular, but it's the one we should all be using when we use SNMP. This is going to provide authentication, message integrity, and encryption for all of our SNMP protocol data units or packets. So this is going to provide actual true kind of access control because you can put different users as a part of your SNMP version 3 environment. You can set hashing so when the username and password gets sent across, it's not sent in plain text. You can configure encryption, which is going to encrypt the data payload of the SNMP packet, which is going to contain that information about OIDs and so on. And then there's going to be different security levels for SNMP. So here's our 3 security levels. So we're about to get into them in the next slide. So with SNMP version 3, this kind of is a little misleading because you can set up version 3 with no authentication and no privilege, which means no encryption. But then what's the point, right? I mean, you might as well just set up version 1 and 2. But version 1 and 2 cannot offer authentication or this priv, which essentially is encryption. So let's go over those different security levels. We have a nice little chart in our next slide. So version 1 and version 2 are going to be no auth and no priv, which essentially means that the only authentication we have is a community string that gets sent in plain text, and we don't have any encryption. And you can see the process here. Uses a community string to match for authentication, so essentially communicating to your NMS and SNMP agent, but it's sent in plain text. And then version 3, you don't have community strings with this no auth, no priv security level. You still have a username though. So you're just using a username to match authentication, but that's also going to get sent in plain text. So, I mean, what's the difference there when you really think about it? Instead, in version 3, we have a username and password we're using. Version 1 and 2 is community string, but they all sit at this level. The difference really is version 1 and version 2, this is all you get. So there's no way to configure different security levels on it. That's just what it is by default. Well, with version 3, you, the administrator, can set your security level. And we'll show you that in the CLI. You can actually set if you're going to have auth and no priv or auth and priv. So auth no priv is going to provide authentication on that username and password and that's using a hashing algorithm like MD5 or SHA. And you're going to want to use SHA because MD5 is vulnerable to collisions. But you're not going to get any encryption. So this priv command is what describes encryption on SNMP. So this is going to authenticate based on a hash username and password. And then version 3, that's off. Priv is the highest security level. Again, you're going to get that authentication using a hashing algorithm with a username and password. And then you're also going to get an encryption algorithm to encrypt that data in transit in that SNMP packet. So it uses, as you can see here, a symmetric encryption algorithm. And again, we're going to want to use AES because triple DES is vulnerable. All right, so now let's get into configuration. So a little bit of security you can do with version 1 and 2 is set an IP address or a subnet that is allowed to actually do these SNMP polls and messages and communicate between NMS and SNMP agent. So what you could do here is, like in our network environment, if we have an NMS server connected to a switch, and then we have our environment, a bunch of switches here off to our router, and this SNMP server, let's say we make it part of our management VLAN. So on each switch, we have 3 VLANs, 10, 20, and 30. And this is the management. And this is 10.10.10.0 / let's see, that says 29. What we can do here is say, hey, only allow that management VLAN subnet to be part of our SNMP architecture. So you can't have some user sitting out here on VLAN 10 or 20 trying to do anything malicious to your SNMP agents or server. So that's one kind of way we can do like access control based off the source IP, saying, okay, only these IPs are going to be allowed to either pull for information or be an SNMP agent. And then the actual configuration of the community string. So as you can see here, yeah, it's kind of good we call them community strings and not just passwords in the slides, because that's how you configure version 1 and 2. You type in SNMP server. So essentially this command is saying our SNMP server that's going to be pulling us for information is going to be part of this community TREPA here. And this community is read-only access. And then we have access control here based on the source IP. So we're only going to allow polling from an SNMP server that's a part of this community string. It's only going to be able to read information about us, and it has to come from an IP address that's permitted in this access list. Then we have the exact same thing here with a different community string name. So these are 2 different communities. This community has read-write access, and same thing though, we're only going to accept SNMP server polling messages or get or set messages from a polling server or an SNMP server that resides in an IP address based off this access list. And then if we want to configure SNMP trap or inform messages, we do this with an SNMP server. And then this host command is going to say, hey, now we're kind of reversing the roles here. I want to send information to the server. So we're going to view that as a host. And here's its IP address. And then here's the community string it's a part of. And then that's going to set the trap messages. And then underneath here, we'd have to put like SNMP server trap, actually configure our thresholds of what we want to send. And then these inform messages are going to be configured a little different because they're only going to be a part of version 2, inform messages, and 3. But essentially then it's the same thing. We're going to tell it what community string it's a part of. And then underneath here, we would put our trap and inform messages thresholds. I just put these commands on here now because remember, we're just going over simple SNMP. So I just wanted to show you what it's like to actually, the first step in setting a trap or inform message. Now let's go over version 3. So version 3 the configuration starts off the same. We can also put an access list on our SNMP version 3 configuration. So we're only going to accept SNMP polling messages from a server that resides in this subnet. And then the first thing we're going to do is this view command. So I was talking about this earlier. So what we're going to do is essentially say, hey, for any SNMP server that's going to poll us, we want them only to be able to view, and then we're going to give it a name, ISO. So remember, and if we go back, or actually, let me just bring it up over here, SNMP MIB structure. I'll just bring it up into this actual presentation so we can see it side by side. If we actually look at this structure here, see if we can bring this up a little bit. Okay. ISO is the root. So with this view message, what we're saying is, hey, any SNMP server that polls us, we want them to be able to pull for all this information. And we give it that view name because when we get into the configuring the SNMP version 3 user and pretty much the authentication and encryption, we're going to have to reference this view name right here. So our name is my SNMP lab. So again, this command is going to say, hey, we only want you to look at this section of the OID tree or the MIB. And with this command excluded, it's kind of counterintuitive because this is pretty much saying you can't look at this. And then our next command, if we wanted to have any information go to our SNMP server, would be something like this, my SNMP lab 1, and then we'd say like MIB -2 included. So essentially this group here, my SNMP lab, is saying you can't poll us for anything. You can't get shit out of us. But this is saying we only let you view MIB2. All right, and then on to configuring the server group. So now we got to configure the group, and this is where we're going to say, hey, if a user is part of this group, we're going to give them write access. So read or write access, and then it's going to be a part of this view group. Okay, and then also from these IP addresses. So what this is saying is we need to create an SNMP version 3 group. We give it a name. It's going to be version 3. And then anybody that's a part of this group, we're going to give them write access, which essentially this is saying read/write. And then they're going to have read/write access on any OID that falls within this view group. So remember before we made it a part of ISO, so they'll have read and write access on the entire MIB. And then of course we specify an access list that's going to define source IP addresses that are going to be allowed to do this. So again, let's kind of go through it. So we create a group, SNMP server group, and if you're a part of this group, you're going to have privileges to read and write on this view group, which specified that we're going to be able to give up information for the entire MIB because we said this view group will have access to ISO, which is the root, and only if you're sourced from an IP address that's permitted in this access list. And this will make more sense once we actually configure. So do not worry. And then we need to configure the user. So this is where we get into that security model of auth and priv, or auth, no priv, or no auth, and no priv. So here's where we define our security models. So in this example, we're going to configure auth priv, which is going to give us a hashed password and use, well, yeah, just a password, but part of that username and password. And then priv is going to let us encrypt the SNMP payload. So here's the command. SNMP server user, we're going to specify the username. And then we're going to say this user is a part of this group. We're running version 3. And we want to hash the password with SHA. And then we got to actually set our password. So it should be 8 characters, okay? Remember that, 8 characters. And then we want to make sure that we're doing encryption as well on the actual SNMP password. Or sorry, the SNMP packet, the payload. And there's also going to be a priv password in here that should also be 8 characters that you're going to need to kind of sync up that encryption with the NMS, okay? Kind of like that private key, right? For our symmetric encryption. All right. And I say kind of, it's just a way to describe it. We just need that priv password along with setting our encryption here. So that is going to be the full configuration of SNMP version 3. It seems like a lot, but it's really not. Just to get it working, you just need to specify a view group. So this one is saying you can view ISO, okay? So you can see if you're part of this view group, you're going to be able to get either read-only or read-write access to our entire MIB infrastructure or database. And then this is saying this group admin is going to be read-only, and it's going to reference this view group. So that means anybody that's a part of this group is going to be able to have read-only access to ISO. And then this user, Bob, is going to be part of this SNMP server group, which has read-only access to the entire MIB structure. And Bob is going to have authentication and not an integrity on his password using SHA. And then here's his password. And then we're also going to have encryption on that SNMP payload or packet using AES 128 bits. And here's the priv password that also has to match with the NMS server. So this right here is going to be also configured on your NMS server because they have to match, right? We need to have that user and that group on the NMS server and also on our SNMP agent so they can match and authenticate to each other. Whew, so that's SNMP version 3 configuration. Now let's go over some verification. So this command here showed us the SNMP group is going to show you all the groups that you created and what versions. And then the show SNMP user command. This is going to show you what users you created and if they have like encryption and authentication on that user. So you can see from this command that we're using the auth priv security model because we do have encryption and hashing. And then this user is going to be part of group 1. Okay. Whew, so I know that seemed like a lot. And when I first started learning at SNMP or really CCNA, now let me bring my face back in here. I'm going to talk to you eye to eye. It was hard for me at first because SNMP version 1 and 2 are very simple. You're essentially just putting a password, even though we call it a community string, and boom, you got connectivity to the SNMP server. The SNMP server, you also configure that community string. With SNMP 3, it's not that there's a lot of commands. It's just the commands are so long, and if you don't truly understand the security models and what you're doing with that CLI command, it can be a little confusing. I know for me, the view, let me go back to it. This view command always did confuse me until I actually got hands-on and understood what it was saying. It was pretty much saying that if you're part of this MIB directory, or essentially you only have access to this MIB directory that sits on my SNMP software as an SNMP agent, right? So that one kind of confused me a little bit, but when we get into configuration, you're going to see that it isn't too bad. You just got to break it down into steps. And as you progress in your Cisco career, you're going to notice that with a lot of configuration, like especially IPsec IKE version 2 profiles, it's a lot. But you just got to break it down and go through the mental steps saying, okay, for version 3, I know we need 3 things. We need a view group saying what an NMS can see on us, what we want to give them access to as far as our OIDs. Then we got to make a group. And in that group, that's where we define read only or read write. And we got to reference our view group because we got to know what they can have read or write access to. And then we can configure our user, which is going to be part of that SNMP group. And that user is going to be giving us our security levels of hashing and encryption, or hashing no encryption, or no hashing and no encryption. So I hope this video was informative. Feel free to rewatch it. I know I had to a lot when I was learning SNMP. And let's jump into the lab. So thank you for viewing.